So good evening. Welcome back to Down with the Crown, part 2. Let's take a moment, get settled in our spaces. Take a breath or two. And then I invite you to join me in the bracha for Torah study. Adonai, Melech haolam, asher kishanu divrei Torah. All right. So last week, we saw the beginnings of the idea of a king amongst the Israelite people. The issues that a king was meant to solve. One, we had this phrase in the book of Judges: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So there was no one to administer justice for the people as a whole, but also to lead them in battle and to be like all the other nations in the area. And we talked about a king having responsibilities versus taking responsibility a little bit, but also the problems that a king can solve and create. And now this week, we're going to talk about David and Solomon. We're going to skip over Saul, who was technically the first king, who had a short reign, a couple years, and it was a turbulent reign. And David had been anointed as king in his as heir apparent while Saul was still alive. And before Saul died, he actually tried to kill David a couple times. And both times that he got close, David actually snuck in and had the chance to kill Saul, but did not, because David repeatedly said, I don't want to, I want no one to raise their hand against God's anointed, which was David's way of saying, when I'm king, I don't want anybody doing this to me, so I'm not going to do it to anybody else. So when David becomes king, there's still some trepidation among the people about exactly how this institution is going to go. And one of the military leaders, named Joab, had to be part of gathering all the people together to get David in power in an official way. And I'm going to share my screen. So the king, the inauguration of the monarchy was with Saul. Now they're making King David king over Israel. They go to the city of Hebron, and one of the interesting things from that episode is the people say, we're your own flesh and blood. Just a reminder, you are our relative, we are your relatives. That connection is going to be important for the people, especially once we get past the biblical era and have non-Israelite, non-Jewish kings ruling over. And the people also say, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us in war. So the people acknowledge that David has already been doing this battle role of the king and has been doing it very effectively. And so they assemble, they make an official pact, an official document, and anoint David king over Israel. There we go. David king over Israel. David was 30 when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. So a good long reign. That formula of so-and-so was this much old when he became king and he reigned for so many years, is used throughout the book of Kings, the book of Chronicles. It's like the boilerplate summary, like, here's stuff about David as king. Although in this case, in Samuel, it doesn't serve that function the way it does in the book of Kings. And David's initial reign is just like he had started out, leading them in battle. There are several different battles because different people hear that, oh, David has become king. Maybe they're weak now, and they come to attack and get slaughtered, driven out, chased away, and beaten in all possible forms. So David keeps getting stronger now. He's king, and he's being established as a powerful king, at least in terms of able to defend the people. And King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys with cedar logs, carpenters, stonemasons, and built a palace for David. Thus, David knew that Hashem had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingship for the sake of God's people, Israel. So there's an element of David's piety that is important in his rule. So David repeatedly has encounters with prophets, asks God for instruction in various correct manners from the prophets. And he often inquires, should I go up and attack? And sometimes God says yes, and sometimes God says, no, plan B. You should sneak around and attack from behind, or some other option. But the book of Samuel says, Hashem gave David victory wherever he went. He reigned over all Israel, and he executed true justice among all his people. That line, he executed true justice among all his people. There isn't a whole lot in the book of Samuel that even indicates that he sits and makes decisions when people have cases that they need to bring to someone. And we really have just this one line about executing true justice. So what do you think that is, that true justice that David would be executing?
Is it just military?
It could just be military. That is one option. The true justice being, we've been at war with our neighbors, and now we're winning. It could be that he was actually sitting as a judge and deciding cases. Anita.
Or making sure that was happening, to sort of respond to that issue of, before there was a king, everyone did what they wanted and did what was right in their own eyes. Now there's just one way of doing things.
Right. So David has this really great reign. There's several chapters of all the great stuff that David does. Basically, Samuel 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cover all the good stuff that David does. And the book of Chronicles, which tells much of the same story as Kings, but a little differently, also says that David became famous throughout the lands, and Hashem put the fear of him in all the nations. You did not want David on the other side in battle because you were going to lose.
Well, didn't David slaughter the whole populations down to the last child?
There, yes, here and there. There was one passage I remember where it said David had them lay out on the ground and measured off a cord, and every two were put to death, and the third one was spared. So, like, slaughtering large groups of people, yes, is the story. But David, as king, never loses a battle. He gets close to losing a battle, but the battle doesn't happen, so he can't lose. So before we get to how David's kingship begins to slip, what all do you remember about hearing King David do? Do you remember anything?
Well,
In terms of what?
yeah,
Like anything that
Bathsheba. Bathsheba.
he was a
Bathsheba.
psalmist. Yeah,
All right.
right.
So we've got the Bathsheba incident.
The psalmist,
He writes
he
the
was a
psalm.
musician, right.
The Psalms. Anita, which?
He was a psalmist, he was a musician, he sang, he was, and yes, definitely the whole Bathsheba incident.
So David does all sorts of good stuff and great stuff, and the rabbis go on and add some more legends about him. But there is a moment during his reign where everything begins to turn. And it is actually the incident with Bathsheba. At the turn of the year, the season when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab, his chief military officer, and all Israel with him, and they devastated Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. He did not go out to battle at the season when all the kings went out to battle because he apparently didn't want to, or didn't feel the need to, because the troops were going to win. Never losing can make you a little bit pompous about that. Late one afternoon, David rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and the king sent someone to make inquiries about her. And it was reported she's Bathsheba, or Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. David sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him. How can you refuse the king? And he lay with her. Again, as a woman in that time, could you refuse the king? And she went back home, and then shortly thereafter sends him a message that she's pregnant. Uriah the Hittite was one of David had about 30 to 40 like really great core warriors around him, sort of like King Arthur's knights around King Arthur. And Uriah the Hittite is one of those warriors. So David tries to get Uriah to come home from the battle that he sent Joab and the army out to, and Uriah doesn't want to do it. But Uriah does come back to Jerusalem, but then he ends up spending the night in the palace with the soldiers rather than going home, because David's looking for anything to like cover this pregnancy. Like, we just need him a night at home and then we're good. The next night, David gets him drunk, and he is stumbling around. He still ends up sleeping with the soldiers. So David sends Uriah the Hittite back because, well, that cover story won't work. So he tries a different tactic. He writes a letter to Joab, which he sent with Uriah, sealed, I'm pretty sure if Uriah had opened it and read it, if Uriah had been able to read, the incident might not have happened the way it did. Because David wrote as follows: "Place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then fall back so that he may be killed." So when Joab was besieging the city, they stationed Uriah at the point where Joab knew there was going to be fierce fighting, and the men of the city came out and attacked, and some of David's officers fell, including Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent a full report of the battle back to David. So Joab covers for David a lot. Joab is chief of the army, also chief hitman, chief enforcer. So rather than just drawing back and letting Uriah be the only person killed, there's a plausible explanation Joab gives him of, we made a little blunder. We got too close to the city. They weren't ready to give up. And so they came out and attacked, and we lost some people, including Uriah the Hittite. Which David's goal of finding a way to cover the pregnancy, well, if you can't cover it, just get rid of the problem, and the problem would be Uriah the Hittite, the husband of the woman that David is about to take into his house as his wife. He does so after Uriah is dead and the period of mourning is over. Bathsheba comes into David's house, and from there, several things happen. The child she is carrying, she gives birth to it, but the child dies in infancy, maybe within the first week or two after being born. And David is very distressed about this, fasts and prays, and then once the child is dead, gets up and eats and bathes, and his advisors are just extremely confused, because he should act like a king until the kid's dead, and then he should mourn. He shouldn't do it in reverse. And David said, when he was still alive, perhaps I could have done something to appease God's anger. I clearly could not. And he is now dead. I will go to him, but he will not come back to me. David's just very realistic. And Bathsheba is one of David's important wives, because Bathsheba is the mother of Solomon. And Solomon is born around this time, a little bit later, a year or two or three. But also, David gets put on the spot by Nathan the prophet, who may have been one of his sons, may have been a relative, and may have just been a prophet. And when Nathan's putting him through the ringer, Nathan condemns him and says, "Why then have you flouted the command of Hashem and done what displeases God? You have put Uriah the Hittite to the sword. You took his wife and made her your wife, and had him killed by the sword of the Ammonites. Therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you spurned me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and making her your wife." When a king makes an error, it's not a small error, it's a big error. And David goes out and makes one of the biggest errors that you can make. He managed to break at least 3 of the 10 commandments, possibly more. Depends on your understanding of stealing, murder, false witness, adultery. So David makes a huge mistake. But people make huge mistakes all the time in their lives. And bad things happen or they don't as a consequence. David makes a bigger mistake, however. After this incident, he makes a much bigger mistake. And we don't actually find out exactly what the mistake is until we've read the full story and go, oh wow. Because David's sons start squabbling. David has several different sons. Ammon is his oldest, followed by Absalom and Adonijah, followed by several, I don't remember if it's 7 or 14 or some large number. And Solomon is in amongst that mix. And I'm going to stop the share for the moment. So Tamar is Absalom's full sister, Amnon's half sister. And Amnon says, she's beautiful, I want her. And so a servant, has a servant concoct a story and gets her to come in to his bedchamber, and then seizes her. And she tries to say, if you just asked Dad for me, he wouldn't say no. You're the firstborn. You get whatever you want. But Amnon raped her. And Absalom tells her in the moment when she's traumatized, stay in my house, keep quiet about it. I'll take care of it. And so the way that Absalom takes care of it, one, all this is told to David, and David's upset, but David doesn't do anything about the incident. He doesn't do anything at all. He doesn't execute justice in his own house. He doesn't act like a father to his children in any reasonable capacity. Absalom didn't utter a word to Amnon, good or bad. Maybe, thinking that Dad will take care of this. And well, when Dad doesn't, Absalom hated Amnon. And 2 years later, when he was having his flocks sheared, which was a cause for celebration, there's often a feast that a rich man throws when it's time to shear the sheep, because one, that gets a bunch of people together, and two, it's a way to relax from doing the work of shearing sheep. And he invited all the king's sons. And he gets them all nice and drunk, and then has his retainers kill Amnon. And David hears of this, but here's the rumor that all of the sons have been killed. And David falls on the ground weeping. And a messenger arrives and confirms, no, it was only Amnon because of what he did to Tamar. David never addressed that issue in his house. And so Absalom kills Amnon. After that, Absalom starts to get a little impatient with his father. I wonder why. And he starts saying, you know what? I could be a better king. And he stations himself at the gate of the city. And when someone comes and says, I have a case for a judge to hear, Absalom says, does the king appoint anyone to hear your case? Of course not. Here, I will appoint so-and-so to hear your case. And Absalom actually functions as that judicial officer for some time before he goes and rebels and says, you know what, I'm king now. So he gathered the people in Hebron, where David was made king. So there's a symbolic feature to his action there. And he gets several of David's advisors and several people who were unaware at first, but once they had gone with him, they were like, oh yeah, no, you should be king now. And someone told David, and David's response is, let's run away or none of us will survive. And they flee. And Absalom stays in Jerusalem for a while, and gets some good advice and some bad advice, and listens to the bad advice. Gathers up basically the whole kingdom and goes to chase down David. And in the midst of that, Absalom ends up away from the rest of his army, caught in a tree, possibly by his long, luxurious hair, because he had long, luxurious hair, of course. And Joab personally kills Absalom, and has several of his men-at-arms continue to hit Absalom until they are quite sure he is dead. And David, who had exiled Absalom for a while because he killed Amnon, then brought him back, and then just never really dealt with him. The king goes into this mourning that is almost inconsolable. It just, oh, my son Absalom. And Joab comes in and says, you've humiliated everybody who follows you. And so David puts himself together, because Joab says, if you don't, there won't be a single person who's with you overnight at this point. And like, it will be a greater disaster than any disaster you've had. And so David does pull himself together, but nothing's the same. So the men of Israel and the men of Judah are arguing at this point. They haven't officially split into different kingdoms, but they're about to. And the men of Israel said, we have 10 shares in David, and you have really one. But the men of Judah were the ones to escort the king back to the throne, because they were his kin. It was our tribe from whom this king came. So we were, of course, the ones to bring the king back. David doesn't act in this dispute at all. And immediately afterward, a scoundrel named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjaminite, sounded the horn and proclaimed, we have no portion in David, no share in Jesse's son. Every man to your tent, O Israel. All the men of Israel left David and followed Sheba, son of Bichri, but the men of Judah accompanied their king from the Jordan to Jerusalem. Now, the kingdom isn't split, but the crack is there. The crack is there. So David, again, war breaks out, and David's getting old, and he actually, in this battle, he grew weary. And somebody actually tried to kill him. And Abishai, the brother of Joab, saved David. And David's men declared to him, on an oath, you shall not go out with us to battle anymore, lest you extinguish the lamp of Israel. Literally, we can't continue to save you if you keep doing this. You are too old. Go home. So, of course, David is now old, advanced in years, and though they covered him with bedclothes, he never felt warm. So when a king is old, what happens? The succession war or conflict begins. Unless there's a clear line of succession that's been established and everyone agrees to it, there's going to be some conflict. And in David's house, at this point, there was nothing but conflict. So Adonijah, son number 3, but now the oldest, a surviving son, went about boasting, "I will be king." And he took chariots and horses and an escort of 50 outrunners, and he went around proclaiming that I'm going to be king. Once the old geezer kicks the bucket, it's me. And Bathsheba gets her revenge. Nathan, the prophet who scolded David earlier, comes to her and says, "You must have heard that what Adonijah is doing. Go to David and say, did you not swear to me your son Solomon shall succeed me as king and sit upon the throne? Why has Adonijah become king?" And this plot works. David, who is old, can't see real well, can't think real well, it's like, "Oh, of course I swore to you that Solomon would be king. Let's put my robe on him right now and have him sit on my throne right now." And Adonijah hears of this and flees to the tent where they have the ark. And he grips the horns of the altar, where you're not supposed to take someone down to kill them unless you have like clear proof that they are in fact a murderer. And Adonijah gets Solomon to swear that as long as Adonijah behaves, Solomon won't touch him. And Solomon said to him, "Go home." Now, after David dies, Adonijah comes around and says, "I want just one favor, since I should have been king, but I wasn't. I want that young woman that helped keep Dad warm before he died." And Solomon said, "You should have. That's like asking for the throne itself. That concubine is a wife of the king. You would make you a rival claimant." And Adonijah is killed. So David's sons, of all of them, Solomon becomes king. Several of them are just footnotes, and the rest are killed in succession, one by the other. Amnon by Absalom, Absalom then by Joab, and then Adonijah by Solomon. So Solomon is a great king, exceedingly great in the eyes of Israel, endowed him with a regal majesty that no king of Israel before him ever had. That line is from Chronicles, but Solomon is a greater king than David, Saul, and possibly the one of Saul's sons who claimed to be king, but only over part of the people, and was summarily executed by some attendants when David came around. Rather than there being any conflict, the guy's own servants killed him. So Solomon is this great king, right? Now, remember in Deuteronomy, it says you can have a king, but the king has to be one of your own kin, can't keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to get horses, shall not have many wives, nor amass silver and gold to excess, and have a copy of the Torah in front of him at all times. And so what happens in Solomon's reign? He builds the temple, and then he also amasses large quantities of gold, quantities of spices unnumbered since that gift from the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon. King Hiram's fleet, the guy who built the palace for David, or maybe his son, brings gold to Solomon, and a huge quantity of precious wood that ends up in the temple, and precious stones. And all the world ends up coming to pay homage to Solomon and listen to his wisdom. And each one brought tribute, silver and gold. And Solomon assembled chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. And his horses were procured, it says, from Mizraim, not Mitzrayim, but Mizraim it's Egypt. It's Egypt. But they were exported through this other kingdom, so they weren't really Egyptian, right? And Solomon loved many foreign women in addition to Pharaoh's daughter. He had, one of the texts says hundreds, it's this one, 700 royal wives and 300 concubines. And his wives turned his heart astray, and he built altars to other gods. So Solomon, the great king, manages to break every single possible rule that Deuteronomy lays out for the king, except maybe the Torah scroll thing. Because he did have that wisdom. He may have had some teaching going on in front of him, but still, he got the horses from Egypt. He had foreign wives who led him astray, and he had gold and silver to access. Solomon was this great king, right? This great king who broke the rules. Now, the end of Solomon's reign, we get the introduction to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and we will come back there towards the end, and if we don't get back to him, we will do that next week to begin. But David and Solomon are really the two kings of the United Monarchy of any note. They both reigned for 40 years. They both are labeled as great. David has endless military victories. Solomon does one of the things that is the greatest, single greatest thing that the Book of Chronicles could even think of, which was build the temple. The Book of Kings says it's one of the greatest things the king could do, but it isn't the greatest. There's someone who's coming later who will beat Solomon in that accord. But David and Solomon become the measuring stick for all the kings that come after them. And David and Solomon are put up on a pedestal over the years. And they're only viewed as great. They're not viewed as being human or flawed or failing. So David's mistake really is that he doesn't be a father in his family and doesn't execute justice in his family. And if he can't do it in his family, how can he do it in the kingdom? He ends up taking a census, which is forbidden, causing a plague. In his old age, David doesn't do a great job of being king. In his middle age, David doesn't do a great job of being king. It's only when he's early in his reign that he does the, quote, great job of being king. So why are they the measures that every king thereafter is compared to? That David and Solomon are viewed in this very high way. Like building the temple is a great thing. Like that, without that, we wouldn't have the first temple, quite literally, but the second temple, that building where they put the Ark of God and until the Babylonians stole it and took it who knows where. Why are David and Solomon the greatest kings? Any ideas?
I mean, they both accomplished huge amounts of things. And the fact that they were flawed actually makes it more of a real story. I think for me, that's just me personally. I
Yeah.
mean, the fact that they are flawed doesn't necessarily take away from their importance. I mean, obviously they're object lessons, but how many people get to step up and be king of a country? I mean, you're going to make mistakes, and they were great in many respects. Even the fact that they continued so long in their reigns. I don't know. I mean, I should just shut up right now. But
Yeah, no. Length of reign is actually one of the ways that good kings are known in the biblical text. If someone had a long reign and wasn't doing bad things the whole time, like clearly they had God's favor. And if they had God's favor, that means the whole country had God's favor, right? The text makes this argument again and again, because if the king is good, like David and Solomon, the whole country benefits. And if the king is bad, the whole country suffers. The perspective that the writer of the Book of Kings, the writers of the Book of Kings takes, it's hard to tell. Do they think a king is a good idea or a bad idea? It's actually really hard to tell, because without the king, they wouldn't have the temple, and several kings do other things that the writers of Deuteronomy and the writers of the Book of Kings both really liked, because there's a secret in biblical studies that isn't very much of a secret. The Book of Kings, and maybe the books of Samuel as well, were written by someone called the Deuteronomistic historian, who was also very much related to the thinking coming out of the Book of Deuteronomy. Those two, the Book of Kings and the Book of Deuteronomy, might have actually been written by the same group of people, which tells you a lot about their theology as well, in a very interesting way. It's like there's this cycle. If you're good, you might remember this from the Shema. If you're good, all these blessings will come forth. And if you're bad, all these curses will come forth. And then what is the history of the people? Well, first, they're good and they get blessed, and then they forget to keep thanking God for all their blessings. And then they get cursed, and then they suffer, and then they remember what they're supposed to do and they repent, and then they're good, and then they get blessed. And it's just a constant cycle, which is a very interesting way of looking at the world, in a way that does not match how we think about the world in the modern day, in a great amount. There is some amount of it. I know that there are some strands of Christianity that are actually very much in the idea of that Deuteronomistic theology of the blessings and curses. If you're good, blessings. If you're bad, curses. But that's an uncomfortable idea for us, because we have a long history of going, we weren't bad and we still got cursed. And we were good and we didn't get blessed. So there's an argument in the Jewish people that goes back more than 2,500 years about why do bad things happen to good people? And it hasn't been settled, but there is, you find that chain You find it in the rabbinic literature. You find it in the medieval literature. You find it in modern literature, whether it's fiction or it's a nonfiction book like Rabbi Lawrence Kushner's "Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People?" So David and Solomon being the measure for kings is about some sort of claim as to what a good king is. And a good king appears to listen to God more often than not, and try to provide for the well-being and the safety of the people, military victories, and also has a very important religious function, because David brings the ark from where it had been to Jerusalem once he makes Jerusalem his capital city. And then Solomon builds the temple to house the ark. And the ark is very important in the book of Samuel, in 1 Samuel especially, because the Philistines managed to capture it at one point. And then they got plagued and sent it back on a cart pulled by cows with golden mice and golden balls that are thought to represent tumors. The bubonic plague actually would have that sort of would cause that sort of swelling on the human body. And it's interesting that it's golden mice, because the bubonic plague is endemic to rodents. But the Ark of God getting captured and then wherever it is seems to benefit very strongly from it. When David's bringing it to Jerusalem, they cross a stream and it totters a little bit. And one of the people walking with it touches the ark and instantly dies, because you're not supposed to touch the ark directly. And David says, you know what? We're not going to take that thing any further. Leave it here. 3 months later, he's told that the place where he left it is benefiting. It's flourishing. It's got great crops. It's got all this great stuff. And so David says, no. Let's make sure we finish bringing that into Jerusalem. And he brings the ark the rest of the way in, and no one else dies in that episode. But David performs this incredibly important religious function by centralizing the worship in a way by bringing the ark. And then Solomon builds the temple for the ark, where there's this point where everyone can gather. And in the book of Deuteronomy, it says again and again and again, the place where God will choose to make God's name dwell there. Jerusalem, the temple, that spot. The book of Kings, the book of Samuel to a degree. David and Solomon are the greatest of kings because they started to centralize the worship, which is the book of Deuteronomy is all about not having shrines in the outlying spaces. Everyone comes to Jerusalem for everything. There's no reason to have anything outside of Jerusalem, is the ideology in the book of Deuteronomy. And there's one other thing that David and Solomon have that no one after them has. The united monarchy. They are the king of Israel and Judah. And following Solomon's missteps, we get the beginnings of the house divided. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who we will be talking about a lot more next week, was in Solomon's service. And he raised his hand against the king And here's the circumstances. Solomon had been building these building projects, building a fortress, repairing the city walls. And Jeroboam was an able person who was apparently competent, and Solomon appointed him over the forced labor. Solomon, just like Samuel had warned, Solomon took the sons and daughters of the people for forced labor to build the temple, to rebuild the city, to build up the city, just like the prophet Samuel had warned when he said, you all don't want a king in the first place. And the people said, of course we do. And so Jeroboam goes out of Jerusalem, just on a trip, and meets a prophet. And Jeroboam was wearing a new robe, and the prophet takes it off and rips it into 12 pieces, which is, presumably there was some way of recognizing that the guy was a prophet and not just a madman who just ruined your brand new garment. And the prophet says, Ahijah says, take 10 pieces, for thus said Hashem, the God of Israel, I'm about to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hands, and I will give you 10 tribes. I won't take the entire kingdom away from him. I'll keep him as ruler for as long as he lives, for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose and who kept my commandments and my laws. Editorial insert, did David? But I will take the kingship out of the hands of his son and give it to you, the 10 tribes. To his son I will give 1 tribe, so there may be a lamp for my servant David forever before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen to establish my name, that phrase from Deuteronomy. But you've been chosen by me. Reign wherever you wish, and you shall be king over Israel. If you heed all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight, keeping my laws and commandments as my servant David did, then I will be with you, and I will build for you a lasting dynasty as I did for David. I hereby give Israel to you, and I will chastise David's descendants for that sin of Solomon's, though not forever. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, is one of 2 people who will be king after Solomon. And the monarchy is ripped apart, and the people, in a way, are ripped apart. And we saw some of those phrases earlier with David, when the 10 tribes, we had the men of Israel said to the men of Judah, we have 10 shares. We have more than you. And this phrase, we have no portion in David, no share in Jesse's son, everyone to your tents, O Israel. Jeroboam will say something very similar after Solomon is dead. And they give Solomon's son, Rehoboam, a few weeks to figure out what sort of king he's going to be. And he's going to be an awful king. So Jeroboam is an interesting figure. And I won't give anything away for next week. But there's a reason that Israel and Judah are set up almost in opposition to each other. And it really is coming back to the whole point of the Book of Kings, the Deuteronomistic history. If you're good, blessings. If you're bad, curses. And the cycle is, you're good, you get blessed, you forget, you do bad, you're cursed, you remember, you repent, you get blessed, you get good things, you forget, you get cursed, etc. It cycles. So David and Solomon, with this united monarchy, these flawed characters, these mighty kings who started centralizing worship in Jerusalem, there's a whole lot of stuff to their stories that feels Arthurian. It feels legendary. It feels mythic. And there is some debate in biblical scholarship about whether or not there was a David or a Solomon. And whether there was or wasn't, we have this story now. And that is what has been driving a debate in our people, this story, and then the Book of Chronicles, which comes around to counter the claims of the Book of Kings, which we will talk about next week as well. Because both Kings and Chronicles say David and Solomon were the best kings ever, except, and they each put forth a candidate for best king ever, surpassing David and surpassing Solomon. And we will talk about why they choose who they choose next week.
Thank you.
Do we have any comments, questions?
I'm not sure when these books were written or these histories, but in those days, didn't other surrounding countries think that their kings were also gods?
Several of them, but not all of them. In the surroundings around where the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were, the archaeology that we keep finding, the kings who ruled were viewed as mortal men until they died. Then they would become gods.
Oh, interesting.
Which is actually one of the ways that Egypt thought of it for some time before Pharaoh was just a god in a human body, and then freed afterward. And the king of Assyria was compared to a god, but was very careful in the annals of the kings of Assyria. The king wasn't gods on the level of the gods. The king served the gods. The king built temples. The king enforced correct worship. The king rebuilt temples that got destroyed. The king was a little god, not a big god.
Okay.
And when you're the emperor of a vast empire, not having a word for that yet, God is close enough, because whatever the emperor says is law. And now Emperor's New Groove, the just bumping the emperor's palanquin. And I'm sorry, you've thrown off the emperor's groove. In those days, throwing off the emperor's groove, usually the result would be a sword applied quickly. So yeah, there was some talk about who was, if a king was god or not, but yes, there was this element of being mortal.
Fascinating.
Other questions? And on the timing of when the books were written, there's actually a lot of debate about if there was a particular period when all of it was written, or if it was a chunk here and a chunk there over different time periods. And then some editor came along and stapled everything together and put in all the commas where they're supposed to go to make it flow at least close to being reasonably smooth reading. And I can actually bring a little bit more next week on that, especially with Kings and Chronicles, because we have some concrete pieces of evidence to show when they were most likely written, because of what they know and what they don't.
Interesting.
Cool.
So long as my transportation works well, I'll be back in time for next week. But
It
if
will
not,
be recorded again, like this one was, and it will be posted. So if you're watching this on the recording and you have questions, feel free to email me, khnSchool@gmail.com.
that's great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Josh.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.